it's time to start again. And this session will be in English. And we're going to discuss who is responsible when a robot acts wrongly. And I'm very happy to welcome Sandberg, that you met before. He's a researcher, computational neuroscientist or something like that. You do a lot of things at the Future of Humanity Institute, but also, which I'm very happy, you're also at the Institute for Future Studies. It's very happy. And then, secondly, we have Michael Laakasuo. He's a postdoc in cognitive science at Helsinki University. And what we're now going to discuss is actually two questions. I mean, one thing is, if we have these robots that are quite autonomous and they act wrongly, who is responsible? Is it the designer, the owner, something like that? But we will also discuss, can we implement ethical rules for robots? Can we put it into their programming so they won't act wrong, they will always act rightly? And I will first give you 5 minutes each to talk a little bit about this, and Anders, you can start.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so what do we do when a robot acts wrongly? Like if that samurai robot starts chopping down the human, who do we blame?
Oh, yes.
And I happen to be married to a prosecutor, so the legal answer seems to be fairly easy, actually. Very strict liability, so whoever owns the robot is in trouble. Except, of course, that they might run off and say, yeah, actually, the robot is not the problem here, it's the software. We just gave this robot a very sharp sword and put it close to the human. So in that case, of course, the court would probably say, yeah, the sharp swords and the robots waving around, yeah, you're still liable for this. But there might be other situations where it's less clear that there was negligence on the side of the owner of the robot. They honestly believed it was a safe system, so they trusted the software or the hardware, and then things went wrong. And this is, of course, extra interesting when we get to things like autonomous cars. If an autonomous car runs over somebody, it's not the driver, the person sitting in the car who did anything wrong. Assuming he couldn't stop the car or react, well, it's most likely that whoever made the car. I noticed in the news, actually, that Volvo now has declared that they will actually be fully responsible for what autonomous cars do that they have made. Which, of course, still leads to an interesting question. Who inside the organization is responsible? I had a meeting with some vehicle engineers a few years ago, where they wanted me to tell them about ethics and what to tell the court, because they knew sooner or later we are going to end up in court, and then we better have some nice defense. And in some cases, of course, this is very clear. You design something, you test it very carefully. You might even be able to prove certain things about what your engineering system can and cannot do. The problem happens, of course, that when you put a complex system in contact with a complicated real world, especially if it's learning and adapting, it becomes extremely hard to verify from the start what it will do. So it might be that in court, the car maker shows up with 10,000 pages of printouts demonstrating why the car did what it did. And now the court will have to decide whether that is proof that it was actually okay. And of course, what the court is going to do is probably give those 10,000 pages to some expert who might see if they actually just follow procedure. That's at least my guess at it. So in the end, we might solve this in the normal, somewhat sloppy legal approach. It still works reasonably well for a society, in most cases. The real problem happens when we get to ethics. So the car is driving along and a child jumps out in front of it. Should the car veer into a wall and maybe hurt its passengers in order to save the child? In that case, this is kind of a typical ethical problem, and we might discuss what a driver ought to be doing there. If it was a human driver, there is a moral dimension to sacrifice yourself or in order to save somebody. But if there's a piece of software, The software will, of course, just have to do this decision. Somebody else wrote that software, and at least for a car, it's going to be a relatively simple thing. And we might then discuss, was that the right moral choice? And why did they impose it on that car owner? Maybe different cars run different software. So the Volvo car is very utilitarian and always maximizes the number of saved lives, while there might be some sociopathic sports car that only cares about its owner, or maybe about its own finish. Maybe everybody gets killed, but it still looks good. And then afterwards, it's a separate question from the legal issue, what we think about the moral issue. Maybe we might decide, okay, across society, we should just decide the standard traffic ethics and agree on it. And that might very well be what will actually happen from a practical standpoint, because there's an awful lot of political and legal agreements that need to go into making a road system that contains autonomous cars. The real problem is, of course, in this case, the car is not philosophical and moral agent. It's just following instructions. It's not reflecting on anything. To a philosopher, a moral agent needs to be able to realize, I'm doing this, and I could be doing something different. Maybe I ought to do that different thing for some reasons, and then change its behavior according to those reasons. There are also moral patients. These are entities that we need to care about, but we're not moral agents. An infant is a good example. We care about them, but we're not moral agents yet. Some animals we tend to regard as moral in patients that you're not allowed to harm or punish too much. It's going to be a while before our robots become moral patients, although some of them might be good at faking it enough that we treat them nicely. And it's going to be even trickier to get them to the moral agenthood status. But that means we need to share the world with entities that might look like they're able to act morally, might indeed be somebody's proxy, representing their moral decisions in the form of code. But yet they're not moral agents. So I guess that's something we will be discussing more here.
Indeed,
but I would like to hear the rest of the story here.
Oh, yeah,
Michael, the rest of the story.
Rest of the story. Wow, wish I could provide you with the rest of the story. I think you summarized all the general points that are now surfacing in the discussions, like indeed these intelligent cars and this standard way of presenting the problem. But I think even if the legal issue is supposedly clear now from present-day perspective, I don't think it is as simple as that, because laws are changing, laws are historical. So when it comes to robotic laws or robot ethics and possibly robotic normative ethics, which will then maybe influence the legislation process, it is still part of democracy, a democratic process. We need to be able to ask people how would they like the robot to behave. We will still vote our members of parliament who have to be informed about our worries regarding how robots would need to behave. And I think this is a perspective that we shouldn't forget, so that it will not just be a technocratic decision, a technocratic process of top down, and these are the robots, deal with it. I think this is one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest dangers. And in order for us to decide where the responsibility lies, I think it does require more than just asking legal people or lawyers. I think it does require input from people, and it does require we scientists studying human intuition when it comes to assigning of responsibility. Furthermore, I think once these sorts of issues are resolved through research, through discussion, through politics, maybe also we would need to have some sort of open source robot morality, I think, maybe as a solution. Like maybe in future, and I hope it's not that far away in the future, we could have a United Nations regulation demanding that any code that has to do with moral responsibility and robotics or moral behavior of robots has to be available online for everybody to see, and this would apply to governments and private companies as well. So I think there would be a Wikipedia-like discussion where people debate the moralities of robots leaning on scientific research, and next to it you could see that this part of the debate is implemented in code in this sort of way, and there would be the explanation of some expert provided by how this code does what it does. So in order for us to answer who's responsible, I think we need to have a proper civic discussion and progress as a humanity about ethical and scientific issues relating to morality. Furthermore, I think also if we want to give answer to these sorts of questions, we need to assume that morality might be something like mathematics, that it has an independent existence outside of people. And so if we indeed come to implement morality in robots, we will write a code for it. And then that code sort of is a reflection of this morality, which is like mathematics outside of people. So we need to, in my opinion, take a different sort of approach to this whole problem. And at the moment, if we're saying that lawyers will resolve it, development of technology will resolve it, we will not resolve the issue. We really, really need to get advancements in these fields in order to tackle with this problem that did not exist before today. That would be my 2 cents to begin with.
Thank you very much. So let's start then with the first question here about who is responsible when a robot acts wrongly. Is this a new question, or is it any different from if you have a car accident now and it might either be the person driving it or it might be some manufacturer problem? Does this raise any new questions where we should assign the legal or the moral responsibility when there is an accident or something wrong which involves robot? Who would I start?
I think one can make an analogy, which is quite common, of course, in law. Typical law develops by people looking at, oh, this is new. Do we have anything that looks like it? Okay, that thing. Let's base our laws on that thing. So in the case of a tool or even a vehicle, in general, we have laws which are quite close to your personal responsibility. What's unique about robots is that they can have a certain degree of autonomy. They can start acting because they want it, in some sense. There is an internal activation representation of information that causes them to do something, and you have not explicitly ordered them, and it might not even be possible for you to figure it out. Now, there is a good analogy for that, and that is animals. We actually have quite a lot of laws about how to handle horses and dogs and other pets. And in general, we have strict liability again. If your dog bites somebody, you're responsible, not the dog. Although the dog might still be in trouble because it has now been demonstrated to be a dangerous dog. But you're the one who is legally responsible. And quite often we would even say you're morally responsible. Why didn't you train your dog better? Why didn't you understand how it would react in that situation? You're supposed to be able to handle a dog if we want to allow you as a society to have a dog. And I think one could make something similar here. So having an industrial robot working in a closed enclosure, yeah, that's a very safe thing, and you're having good warning signs. If your robot is following you around, maybe waving a sword around, you're probably not a very good robot owner. You're actually using a robot in a way that's pretty likely to cause trouble, even though you totally believe that it's a safe robot because you've written the code all yourself.
So that's a great analogy, but I guess it breaks down a little bit because the robot is constructed by somebody, whereas I guess a dog or a horse is not, so say there's not a human being that have constructed this. They might have been breeding them, but they haven't constructed. So Michael, would you agree that this analogy, how well does it work?
It works to some extent, but at the same time, we are developing robots, and the next generation of robots will be different than the previous one. It will be more complex, it will be more autonomous. So maybe we can start there, but again, maybe we need new ways of thinking. So maybe we have to be prepared that if robot is this complex, this set of laws apply. If robot is this complex, then another set of laws apply. And maybe we need to have a proper classification system of different levels of AI and how it's implemented. So yes, okay, we can start with the animals, but maybe we have to indeed recognize that the problem is completely new and we cannot rely on old ways of thinking.
So if I get you right now, I think you're thinking about that these robots might be more and more intelligent, and then maybe we can we then assign more responsibility to the manufacturer or less?
That's a discussion that we should have as a collective. I don't have the answers for this. I don't want to
starting from the really simple level, if the robot has learning, that makes it qualitatively different from a robot that has a fixed program. If you just have a sword-wielding robot that is just making the same motions all the time, it seems like that is much less problematic than one that is trying to adapt to the environment or learn cool moves by observing humans, which might mean that it makes some unexpected actions. Even a very simple deterministic computer program can be profoundly unpredictable. There are some scary theorems in computer science showing just how little we can in general predict about software. In practice, quite a lot of software is relatively predictable. But as it gets more autonomous, it seems like the space of possible misbehaviors grows in a lot of tricky ways. So that means that we probably should be more careful about this adaptive system. They could actually misbehave even when they have seemed to be totally safe for a very long time, because they have gradually learned something we didn't think they were learning. So in the end, it might be that, yeah, we might want to have simple and dumb robots for a lot of tasks, simply because we know we can trust them much more than the really clever ones that can perhaps solve good problems, but also when they misbehave, we have no clue on why.
But there's also the problem of development, like there should be legislation guiding the allowed boundaries for development of robots. So indeed, we might want our robots to be stupid, and there might be general recommendations for the industry that keep your robots stupid, but that doesn't prevent somebody from creating a new algorithm that might have completely unexpected behavioral routines, or maybe even if they happen to solve the so-called frame problem, maybe it can abstract and come up with creative solutions that we could not even predict. So in that sense, it's not just that we need to have legislation in place for mitigating responsibility or assigning responsibility to robots or their owners. We also need to have legislation in place before things go wrong, so that we have a system that is prepared for worse, even if the worst never happens, because the risks are too big.
It might be also that it's not necessarily legislation, laws, but we have other forms of regulation. Quite a lot of our behavior is kind of constrained by soft regulations. Then if I want to do an experiment involving animals or humans, there are routines. I need to get ethics approval for that. There are other routines on just good engineering practice. Always check that, always have a safety factor. We might actually set in many different layers beyond having laws against making systems of particular kinds. And that might also be more adaptive, because at the start, we don't really know what these new robots will be able to do. So it might be sensible to start out cautious and then gradually adjust the norms, incentives, and regulations needed as we learn more about what we can and cannot do.
So we have legal responsibility for the owners of the robots, maybe to a certain extent for the manufacturers. If you're looking even further into the future, do you think there will be a point where robots themselves will be morally or legally responsible?
I think that actually there is nothing this 1.4 liters of neural tissue can do that cannot be done by a piece of software. So I do think that in principle we can have software that is as moral responsible, or as little moral responsible as I am. It might take quite a long while, though, because it is a very tricky thing. It's not just that you can learn and update your general rules. You need to also have enough understanding of it. So I think it's going to be a rather tall order to get a morally responsible robot. The problem might be that we get systems that in some domains behave in a very responsible way, and we might even be tempted to say, yeah, they actually do understand, and simultaneously misbehave in other domains. Because we humans are surprisingly bad at judging if something else is a real agent. Many of you might have encountered chatbots like the classic psychologist program, Eliza. It's a very, very simple program. It's just doing text processing. But even when you know that, it's kind of tempting to tell it your life's problems. Somebody's listening, and it's absolute confidentiality, even though there is nobody in there. And similarly, we can fool ourselves very easily. And as these systems get more complex, we might have something that occasionally responsible, occasionally not, in a very different way from how we humans normally behave. So that's going to be tough. However, I think it would be very useful if we could have robots that learned what behaviors are good and bad. We already have reinforcement learning, where you can kind of give rewards and punishments to systems, and then they try to do actions that produce more rewards over time and reduce actions that lead to punishment. That is, of course, not at all ethics in any sense. It's animal training in many ways. But it's still a very useful way, including getting them to try to figure out what value functions and preferences we humans have, which is, of course, really what we want our machines to understand.
And yeah, nothing to disagree there. On a more technological level, there might be things that we cannot expect at all. They might hit us very fast. One thing is that now people who are developing quantum computation, for instance, in MIT, for instance, Seth Lloyd has said that the principal mathematics of the machine learning algorithms implemented by Google are, for all practical purposes, based on the same matrix operations as quantum physics and quantum computation is. So it seems that on its very deep level, nature itself is somehow network computation. So if we can get to that level, then the processing speed and the new types of quantum algorithms that you can write might have unexpected possibilities for developing reflexive and reflective systems which are operating in such immense speeds that we cannot even understand what hits us once it's finally there, if it's ever there. So I wouldn't say that these problems that you're saying are necessarily problems that cannot be circumvented. They might be in front of us sooner than we think.
So one last question about it. So let's say now that we hold even the robot responsible to a certain degree. What are you going to do when a robot misbehaves? Do you reprogram it? Do you put it out of existence? Or do you repossess it? What's the idea?
Well, I guess it depends very much on, do we think it's a moral agent? In that case, we probably need to punish it. However, a reinforcement learning agent, it's also sensible to punish in the sense that it learns that that action was a bad action. Let's not do it again. But in practice, I guess, do we think this system is safe? A weird thing is, of course, that if a particular robot misbehaves, it might actually tell us something about all robots that are running the same software. Because if they're not individually learning, they're all actually the same mind in a sense. Which might mean that if I find out that my robot is a bit dangerous, we might have to have a recall for all robots of that kind. However, the recall might consist of a patch being downloaded. Conversely, this might of course lead to the problem that if they're misbehaving, they might be misbehaving in a convergent way. So on the first Tuesday of every month, they go briefly nuts. That is a rather nasty bug to have or discover. So in the end, we have this weird interplay. It's not so much punishment and ethics as kind of debugging. And normally we debug each other too. If I'm misbehaving, my family will start to kind of frowning at me, and they occasionally even tell me, Anders, you know, you're behaving really badly. And because of my internal reinforcement learning, since I want my family to like me, I tend to try to update the behavior, even if I think it's totally sensible. So the interesting thing is we, of course, are doing a lot of learning ourselves. I think a lot of our ethics is, of course, running on the kind of wetware of our brains. And we can probably learn quite a lot of useful things simply by stealing some good systems in the brain and applying them in our machines.
Again, I agree with most of what you said, nothing there. But I would also argue that the function of punishment is not simply to make the culprit behave properly. The function of punishment is also more social. It is, as Plato said, it functions in order to restore the sense of justice that something has gone wrong, and then with punishment we try to give amends to the, I don't know if it's a murder, to the victims, or that would mean the family of the deceased. So also we need to have some sort of way of, I don't know, punishment or trying to provide aid for those who are left behind when somebody dies because of actions of robots, that they will not be in a mode of suffering for their whole lives, that they will get closure. It's easy to get closure when you see that a criminal is sentenced to jail for 20 years. But with a robot where you're not even sure whether you can think of it as a moral agent, the punishment doesn't serve those who are left behind. So we need to have another way of dealing with difficult emotions of the family members or whoever they're going to be, or whatever the new problems and new modes of accidents are going to be.
Okay, before we move on to the ethics of robots themselves, let me ask you just one very more down-to-earth question. When my computer misbehaves, it's usually because there's been some hacking or something going on. Robots, I guess, can be hacked too, and that might be one of the main causes for them misbehaving. Or is it possible to make them completely safe from hacking? Or are there other special security challenges with robots? You can start.
Well, hacking is indeed a problem, and indeed the IT security regarding that it's probably its own technical field. But I would add that this is not the only problem. There is a documented historical case of a computer virus being born without anybody programming it. In 1988, a book came out by Hans Moravec, and in that book, it's called Mind Children, he describes an event that took place in DARPANET when the computers were shut down and turned on again. There was a small piece of electricity that was left in the RAM circuits, which then duplicated, and it made the computers crash, and then it was transferred into other computers, and suddenly the whole internet of that time was like shutting down and going on by itself. And I don't know how we can respond to these sorts of problems when the microcircuits are getting smaller and smaller, and they're even more vulnerable to quantum interference effects. I'm not an engineer, I cannot answer to these sorts of questions, but I know from history of technology that such accidents are possible.
Yeah, I think in general the state of our computer security is pretty appalling. The problem is we kind of took a wrong turn somewhere in the 70s and chose the wrong security model, and now we're kind of stuck with systems that are far too easy to hack and an infrastructure that is very expensive to update. So the end result is that I'm writing a paper right now about the problem of hacking deep brain stimulation implants, literal brain hacking. Nobody has done it so far, but there is no good software security on the devices, and they can send electric signals into some people's brains. That's kind of horrible. So the obvious thing is the robot shouldn't be connected to the internet. But why do these brain implants have a Wi-Fi connection? Well, it's convenient. And if you have a big dog robot, I assume somewhere there is a guy with a remote control that can turn it off so you can fetch it when it has turnover in a snowdrift. So these robots will tend to communicate with the outside world in rather complex manners. And if you don't pay attention, you will, of course, have security flaws, and there are malicious people out there that might want to exploit. Indeed, there is a project at the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency in the US, and the Cyber Challenge, where we're trying to make software that hacks computers automatically, which from some perspective is a really cool idea, and from a lot of other perspectives, absolutely horrifying. Because if you get software that's very effective at hacking, of course, the best defense is getting similar software that hacks your enemy before he hacks you. So we might actually get essentially robotic hackers. Now, having those things around makes things much more unsafe. So I think what you want to do is design your robot so its communication protocols as simple as possible. We tend to overdo it. As a computer scientist, I know I'm always tempted to add far too much stuff to my programs. And that typically makes them run slower and much less safely. I think it's important when we design robots to actually act in the real world that we actually need to make them sufficiently simple, at least in their interfaces, that we don't easily get maltreated by software.
Okay.
Yeah, and a short comment on the security issues. One thing why Linux is so safe, or why it's difficult to hack, is because the core program of Linux is updated once every 2 months or so, and it constantly changes. So if you have a virus that was designed for the previous version, it cannot act on the next version. It doesn't really matter whether you have virus protection in your computer or not. And another thing is that Linux is completely open. Anybody can see the code, so you have thousands and maybe even millions of people participating soon in writing the Linux kernel, and it's been guarded by the community. Now we have Google, which just a moment ago bought Boston Dynamics, the biggest military robots company in the world, and Google source code is not open. So anybody can sort of realize that this is a huge security issue, for not just for the company or some state. It could be a problem for the whole world. Just saying.
That connects to this interesting concept you mentioned before about open source morality. And let's turn to that topic now. How should we program, or can we program robots to behave ethically, to behave the right way? And how should we do it? Often one here if you've been reading a little bit of science fiction, you heard about Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. Is it something like that? Can it be done? Who wants to start?
Well, I can start, of course. I was already dissing the 3 laws of robotics in my first question period. They are, of course, too simple. I love.
Could you tell the audience about what are they?
So the first law says a robot may not harm or, by lack of action, harm a human being. The second one is that a robot must obey commands from a human, except when they conflict with law 1. And the third one is that a robot needs to protect its own existence unless it contradicts the previous 2 laws. So I think I read and got that right. I was reading an awful lot of science fiction as a kid. And of course, the whole point is, Asimov came up with these laws because they're actually interesting challenges, because all his stories are about robots following these laws and yet doing stupid or dangerous things. So he already kind of demonstrated that a simple interpretation doesn't work. There was a beautiful way out of that actually in the movie Automata, where there was 2 other laws. And some character explained, yeah, this is the human language version of law. In reality, there was, of course, mathematical proofs and weird quantum code and stuff, which is actually what is going on. But the human meaning is roughly this. And then, of course, you can guess you found that these laws were anyway broken in the movie, because otherwise it wouldn't have been an interesting movie. I think the problem is figuring out the full consequence of even simple rules. Well, that is not doable. If there is one thing ethicists love doing is to look at their opponent's ethical system and generate some horrendous conclusion from it. And then ask, so Gustav, do you think you should follow through with this? And typically, of course, this is because human language is sloppy. We might want to express them in a nice, rational form as formal logic. But now we have another problem. Formal logic works very well, but how do I attach it to reality? How do I make sure that symbol corresponds to this glass of water? And that binding is a very deep problem, I think, both in philosophy and computer science.
Yes, well, if we accept Richard Dawkins's thesis that we are biological robots, then I think people are capable of moral action, and people are then moral biological robots. And if everything that we've just said, that morality could be something that is outside of people like mathematics, then in principle we could build indeed a moral agent, artificial moral agent that is capable of moral behavior. It's the same way we are capable without the biological limitations, maybe even without selfishness. So there are, of course, indeed interesting scientific visions, and some of the more interesting and weirder scientific visions are that maybe Christ is a robot, some self-sacrificing child of another being. So.
But that thing about if we could program the laws of morality, leaving aside the very big question whether that it's true that they exist externally, we would need to find them first.
Yes,
and
indeed.
philosophers have been working on this for kind of 2,500 years, and I don't really like the development timeline here.
This is, of course, very true that if philosophy is developing as slowly as it has developed until now, then indeed technology will outpace that development. But maybe at the same time we have stumbled upon some of the universal laws. Maybe the problem is how to implement them. Like if recent suggestions, for instance done by Sam Harris, is that we consider moral questions to be those questions which are related to the well-being of conscious creatures. So anything that increases well-being, no matter if it's a loosely defined term, is something that we ought to do. And if something that decreases the well-being of conscious beings, then that is something we ought not to do. And then at the same time, I guess we do have some sort of consensus on Immanuel Kant's suggestion about categorical imperative, do unto others as you would wish to be done unto yourself. So every one of us wants to flourish, every one of us wants to grow and have well-being. So maybe we might already have some pieces of the puzzle. Maybe we're not stumbling in the dark to that extent. So I'm maybe more optimistic here than you are, I guess.
But let's be concrete here. I mean, this is Kant's categorical imperative that is high up in the sky. But let's take this self-driving car now. And this self-driving car is running down there. There is a child on the road. It could wear off, and then it will kill the driver. How should we program this car? And how should we decide that?
In my opinion, this is at this moment in history, an empirical question which requires democratic participation from everybody.
That doesn't sound an empirical question. It sounds like you think that the right way to program it is what comes up in a democratic process.
At least the input from people who are going to be using those products should matter.
Okay, so a majority decision among the people using them, or?
Well, democracy, the way it's defined now, is never really a majority decision, but at least some sort of discussion, in my opinion, should be had before we decide it has to behave this way or that way. We haven't had the discussion even.
So the problem here is, of course, if there are independent moral laws and we're actually discovering them, we might have discovered more of them now than we had in the past. So maybe that democratic decision would be a better one than would have happened 100 years ago. But we should then expect that if we make a robot in 100 years in the future, it might have different rules that are actually even more true. So it seems like that democratic decision is just going to be an approximation. It's probably not a bad approximation because it would be a behavior of the car that most people would be okay with. The real problem might be that we're going to be a loud group of people saying, no, that's just wrong. I can imagine, actually I started a paper with Immanuel Kant. For some reason he's in Silicon Valley in the future and he needs a car. And he finds that there's only utilitarian cars around that maximize the amount of the survivors.
What is an utilitarian car?
Well, it's a car that tries to maximize the welfare of people.
Of everybody?
Yeah. And then he meets John Stuart Mill, who is driving around a Kantian car, which is actually trying to follow the categorical imperative. And John Stuart Mill is fine with his car because it also kind of helps him, his welfare. But Kant really wants to have his car. Now, the interesting thing here is, you might say that, well, maybe we all decide that let's have utilitarian cars. But there's going to be some Kantians saying, no, that's evil. That's the wrong ethics, and you're embodying it in all these artifacts. You're going to get the children to believe in the wrong ethics, which is really bad. So we have a minority who really staunchly would say, you're actually putting evil into the software. We should be aware that a lot of our technology does embody values and assumptions about humans in rather complicated ways. In this case, we're actually explicit about putting ethics in, which might have a pretty big force on our society. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but we should be rather careful about it.
But at the same time, like through democratic process, we are taking into consideration the well-being of animals, and we are trying to increase the proportion of vegetarianism in our society when it comes to our daily meals. And fine, we cannot force it, but at the same time, even if it is a sort of democratic process, an ongoing discussion, it is nonetheless better than not to have this slow development that gets there step by step, rather than having no development at all.
I think there is a huge market for ethical software. I think most people would like their technology to behave like they would have done in the same situation. But how to do that, how to implement that, that's still going to be hard. I remember when an ex-Google programmer was actually asking a philosopher at Oxford, explain Kantian ethics to me. Half an hour later, with a whiteboard full of arrows and explanation, he just was sitting there shaking his head. I can't write the code for that. It won't run on a Turing machine, which is totally true. We can at most approximate it. And Kant would probably say, yeah, but approximating the true ethics is still pretty bad. However, we still need to have some software that runs in our computers. It's going to be imperfect, like any tool is. So the question might be, we should turn it around. How much imperfection do we accept? How much bias would we accept that our cars have? Maybe they have been trained to recognize people, but mostly people, let's say, of a particular skin color. Would we then say that we got racist cars because they're a little bit less cautious about people that look in a certain way? we might actually say that that's serious enough that we care about it. However, we also have trained them to avoid elks, but not lions. Well, that's not a moral category we care too much about, and besides, there's so few lions around, so maybe that's not a problem. Except, of course, that lions are more endangered than elk, so maybe we should actually care more about endangered species. But again, these are trade-offs which are fairly everyday. We're now dealing with the imperfections rather than trying to achieve a perfect piece of software, which I think we'll never get to.
But going back to a little bit this idea about democratic decision about this, one natural suggestion, I guess, would be that if you're talking again about a self-driving car, is that the person going in it can choose different kind of moralities for it. One is that, okay, save me first, or another one is avoid killing that child. Why wouldn't that be a natural solution?
I'm all in favor of that. We might, of course, afterwards look at it and say, oh, you pressed save me first. You're a pretty nasty person, which is totally all right. We do that kind of judgment depending on how people behave ethically. Ideally, our technology should be our moral proxies insofar they can act as a proxies.
Well, I think this is one of our first genuine disagreements. I would like society...
It took some time, but now
yes,
we're there.
I would really, myself, as a personal preference, like to live in a society that embodies in its laws more ethical assumptions and behaviors that we people could be. So I want the society to be a better version of me. So I would like the society to steer me towards ethical decisions and ethical behaviors. And if there are indeed such things as realistic, true ethical laws in the structures of the universe, I would not want to live in a society that supports the possibility of breaking them.
But that could be true that it is that, but still people will disagree what it is. So what do you do then? There's a disagreement. Some people think it's some kind of counter-morality. Others think it's some kind of utilitarian morality.
That's a discussion that we still need to have. I don't have answers for that.
Good. We are getting close to the... Yes, actually, we are getting close to the end. So thank you very much for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.